Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day, we are interviewing consequential voices in the global battle against COVID-19, which is the defining challenge for the U.S. and much of the world in this era. At least I think it is. And today, we're fortunate to have Tom Bossert. He's a former White House Homeland Security Advisor to President Trump. He's former Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, current Chief Strategy Officer with Trinity Cyber Incorporated, and he's a national security analyst for ABC News. He knows a lot about dangerous stuff. 3 years ago, he called for a comprehensive biodefense strategy against a possible pandemic. Thanks so much for joining me, Tom. I want to start with what you saw coming, what you feared 3 years ago. And I don't want to get into blame games. A lot of people are getting it. But what did you think this country needed to do back then, and are we doing it today?
Steve, thanks for having me on. I would back that up even more and give a little credit where it's due. You know, people have been focusing on George W. Bush recently and how he became really vested in this concept after having studied the 1918 flu. But even before he began giving us these assignments and making us develop plans and the capabilities that we're drawing upon today.
Sure.
Senator Bill Frist, who was the then majority leader and a heart surgeon and a pretty accomplished one at that, he was out speaking on this back when people thought he sounded crazy. And I just spoke to him the other day and thanked him for all of the future leadership that he showed back then. And, I guess the real way to answer your question isn't that we all had some crystal ball. It was just the realization that human beings are susceptible to any kind of novel virus, and a contagion that spreads among a population that doesn't have any immunities to it. You know, we all walk around with some immunities to certain strains of flu and colds and so forth. But a new one, a novel thing like this, that spreads like fire through dry tinder. And it's terrifying when you think about it. And so I guess the real answer to your question isn't that in 2017 I was worried. The answer is I became educated on this in 2003, 4, and 5. And the assumptions from then were really key. The assumptions from them were key. It was that a timely, localized response would be imperative to stopping the spread. And of course, that's been now demonstrated pretty effectively, and I'm proud of what the American people have done. But it's also been slightly modified in this particular coronavirus response. We weren't able to, for a number of reasons we can talk about, localize our initial closures. We got to a certain point for a certain set of reasons where we had a national clampdown all at once. Now, of course, that comes with the attendant problem of economic failure or closure or strain. You know, we'll see. I think it'll just be a strain that we'll overcome. But we now have to contend with it as we lift some of these restrictions. And what I would say is the lesson from the past is that we should lift them in that localized fashion that we had preferred to implement them.
That's fascinating. And before we get into lifting sanctions, I want to go back into, just a question. If you were in the White House today and looking at this and you saw the early signs in Wuhan, China, what would you have been doing? And we've heard about Peter Navarro laying out some of these concerns and talking about the need for various supplies in the U.S. system. But I guess the question is, I wonder, if Xi Jinping has a Homeland Security Advisor that would have advised him better, and how much blame China deserves for where we are today.
Yeah, well, I think I'd be doing the same thing inside that I've been doing outside. And that is trying to educate people to wrap their minds around something that very few people ever think about. And, I have to sometimes take a deep pause and try to remain humble here. I don't know anything that wasn't taught to me by some real gods in this field, public health officials and doctors that deserve really all the credit for this. Now, they've been teaching this to me, and we've been exercising and planning and preparing ever since 2005, really 2003 and 4 with Senator Frist. But the idea of then taking all of that experience from 20 years and trying to educate others, leaders in the political and public health fields overnight is a challenge. And, it's a fine balance between sounding like an alarmist and giving a clear kind of alarm bell. And, I don't know if it's interesting to the listener, but sometimes context matters. So let me just, if I can step back for a second, kind of give an example. On 9/11, everybody knows what happened on 9/11, and some people still believe that Secretary Mineta brought down all the planes. Now, while he independently did come to that conclusion, we discovered later that just a few moments before that, one of the air traffic controllers in the TRACON facility that was looking at this problem. He had already come to that conclusion and ordered all the planes down. Now, they both deserve a lot of credit for that, but the context always struck me as fascinating. So, Steve, what I heard was that all of the air traffic controllers were panicking, not panicking, but in a increased adrenaline mode, all trying to figure out what's going on. They're all calling out their numbers, they're calling out their aircraft, they're calling out situation reports. One of the things that happened is one of them saw the second plane come in on television, leaned back from his glass, from his machine, and instead of speaking in terms of air traffic control numbers and reports, he said, "Good Lord, these aren't planes, these are missiles." And the moment he said that and put it into context, the decision became easy for leadership to bring down all of those missiles, because now you're not bringing down planes, you're bringing down missiles. And so, context matters in this field. And one of the things that I started doing in January, and would have been doing if I were still in the White House, would have been trying to contextualize all of this kind of difficult nomenclature. If you talk in terms of curves and first derivative amplitudes and so forth, people tend to gloss over. But if you say, this isn't like an iceberg. I tried that for a while. It didn't really resonate. This isn't like a star. I tried that. You might have heard me say that it's like looking at a star, the delay in ascertaining cases.
Right.
The light you look at in a star left it years ago. And so if that star got sick today, I wouldn't know it for some period of time. And that was a little too poetic. And so then I moved, Steve, real quick, then I moved to a fire analogy. People get that. And so what we'll do the rest of our conversation today is put this into context as if it were a fire. And when it's early and you see it coming, you yell fire. Now, that's not meant to cause panic, but you yell fire in a way that people understand so that they can go still deal with it while there's time. And we'll come to analyzing what was done and not done here in a moment.
I mean, regrettably, I don't want to, you raised it. Regrettably, and I need to raise it, the President of the United States didn't yell fire. The President of the United States said these 15 cases might go to zero. There may have been something else going on behind the scenes, but just short form, was that the wrong signal to send when you said, hey, we've got a fire coming, let's get prepared?
Well, at the first inflection point, he did the right thing, and that was shut down travel from China. At the second inflection point, I'm not sure that any of the leadership, including him, realized we were at that inflection point when we were there for some of our states. So I guess the objective answer is that for 7 states, to include New York, we put in place these social distancing, objectively, we put in these social distancing guidelines after they had already reached a point where they wouldn't be as effective. So it's too late. But for 43 other states, we put them in early and in time. And we're seeing a really, really significant reduction in the attack rate as a result. In fact, so much so, I don't want to say this in a way that people, make me own this number, Steve, but, early math, back of the envelope math suggests that when you disaggregate these numbers, instead of looking at the entire country and entire death per million population assessment, but when you separate the 7 states where we see the worst problem from the other 43, you end up seeing that some had an attack rate of almost 20%, that which we were trying to avoid, that we saw on the Diamond Princess cruise ship early.
Right.
And others and the rest had an aggregate of 1% attack rate. So what people are saying on TV, that social distancing works, that's true, and we have to persist. But it's a testament like I've never seen to the policy and to the guidance of that 2007, 5, 6, and 7 set of documents of social distancing being implemented early. It's an absolutely remarkable tale of 7 Philadelphias that we're seeing in this go-around.
Right. You've said 2 things, or written 2 things, as I understand them, that have really, I think, added to the policy discussion on where we need to go. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things you said is, testing people that are clearly sick, testing people that have passed, bad use of tests, that we need to begin testing on a statistical basis, the broader citizenry in the United States, set it up as an alert. We were not going to be able to test everyone, but there is a modeling mechanism to go after and sort of see those people who are asymptomatically infected, but yet they're out in society. And the second piece you've said is what you just shared at the beginning of the show, which is to reopen America. We need to do it on a limited basis, community by community, and go through almost like the way we've been attacking the virus and taking it on now today in kind of a regional and localized way. And I'd love to hear about both of these tracks. First, the testing, because it really runs against the grain of what almost everyone else is saying. And the second is, what's the strategy for open up this country again?
Yeah, thanks. So let me just put that into perspective, right? So as we were headed towards that second inflection point, late February, mid-February, into early March, most of the scientific community, the public health leaders in this country, were looking for data, understandably, before they recommended to leadership that we shut down essentially with this extreme social distancing set of social interventions. Big cities like New York City, they wanted to have more data to understand the problem. Unfortunately, the way this disease is propagating through people that are sick and don't know it, infectious yet asymptomatic, they didn't have enough time to wait for those really accurate PCR, tests that discover the viral RNA in a subject, all these swabs that we read about and all things are so difficult to perform. Those diagnostic tests, those complicated scientific tests, were in short supply. We've all read about that. But they were depending on those tests in a timely fashion. They needed them before one community reached 1% prevalence of this disease. So we're on this competing path. And I'm not saying that anyone should have done anything differently, but I think what objectively we'll assess afterwards, or the question we'll ask is, should we have dropped our dependence or reliance on a set of diagnostic tests that we really knew we weren't going to get in time, despite our best efforts? You have to drop your hope and look at things clinically. It's always very difficult. And then you have to have a plan B. Well, the plan B was there, and you hear Dr. Birx talking about it now, but the plan B was there. We have a surveillance system that looks for flu-like symptoms every year. And it's really amazing if you go back and look at it. But I was looking at it at the time with some of my informal advisors, and they were showing me that the seasonal flu does this, right? And it always levels out, where there's never a second spike. Well, what we were seeing was a second spike in seasonal flu reported, or flu-like symptoms being reported in the emergency departments in certain places, especially like New York. And now it was pretty clear to some back then, but it's really clear to all now that second spike is still climbing, and it's obviously a result of COVID. And so you have to move to that syndromic surveillance as opposed to that diagnostic surveillance approach. Well, we didn't. We had some time in there. This is only a matter of days or weeks I'm talking about, although that matters. So the reason I raised it, Steve, to answer your question, is now we have to determine whether we're making that same mistake twice. Making mistakes in a crisis, all of us, with a great deal of humility, have to admit that nobody's perfect as we run through something so calamitous like this. But in retrospect, I would say the next inflection point is this May 1st inflection point. And if what we're doing is relying on a set of diagnostic tests that we're not going to have at the volume that we'd like, we should kind of admit that to ourselves. It's not a failure. Admit that we're not going to have as many as we would like, and then prioritize their use. So here's
and just in our last minute, we've got about a minute left, Tom. Can you jump to the issue of how you take that and also talk about how we are going to restart the country?
Here's the prescription for that. There are two forms of infectious people: those that know it and those that don't. Those that know it have symptoms, even if they're mild symptoms. And I think the public health community has to move to a standard in which people that have symptoms, even if they're mild, are presumptively positive for COVID and isolate themselves accordingly and quarantine those that they've been in contact with. That's the contact tracing part that will help us slow this spread and maintain a slow spread until we get a vaccine. And then for those that are sick but don't know it, those are the well right now, those that feel well, that want to re-enter the workforce, we're going to have to prioritize the scarce, accurate diagnostic tests to them and start testing the well. That's counterintuitive to your question. But if we do that, we'll take off the field the people that are well, but infectious, that don't feel it, and those that do feel it. And if you reduce the number of people that are infectious from our society, then you have a good outcome.
So there you heard it, folks. I think it's a fascinating contribution to the conversation. Tom Bossert says to reopen our communities, that we need to test those people who are well. Most communities are not testing people unless they have been diagnosed with some problem. I find it a fascinating contribution. Thank you, Tom Bossert, for joining us today. Thank you all for joining me for the Hill's Coronavirus Report. Stay safe. We'll see you soon.